I could leave. It was a thought that came to me more than once. It didn't scream, it whispered. It didn't break, it sharpened from within. I stood in a room where the light was too soft, and the shadows were too long, and everything around me was silent, as if waiting for me to make a choice. It was dark. Not outside, but inside. Darkness isn't always black. Sometimes it's gray, like morning fog, that falls on your shoulders and doesn't ask for permission. It was incomprehensible. I didn't know what would happen if I stayed. I didn't know what would happen if I left. But something held me. Not fear. Fear is what makes you run. And I didn't run. I stood. Not habit. Habit is what repeats itself. And I was in a moment that never repeats itself. It was a presence. Silent, almost invisible. Like a touch that leaves no trace, but changes you forever. I felt it in the air. In the way I breathed. In the way my heart beat not faster, but deeper. I could have left. But I stayed. Because sometimes staying is not weakness. It is a strength that is not visible. It is a choice that is not explained. It is silence that speaks louder than a scream. And it is from this silence that my story begins. I stayed when everyone left. It was not heroic. It was not beautiful. It was quiet. Like the morning air that does not ask if you are ready to breathe. I stayed when the doors closed one after another. When voices became memories. When hugs turned into emptiness. I stayed not because I knew how, but because I couldn't do otherwise. I was silent when everyone was screaming. And in that silence there was more truth than 1,000 words. Because silence is not absence. It is a presence that does not need explanations. I listened when no one spoke. I listened to the silence. I listened to myself. I listened to what was left between the lines, between the looks, between the pauses. This is not heroism. This is a choice. Being there, even when you don't know how. Even when it hurts. Even when it seems like you are not seen. I stayed in a room where there was only one light. And it didn't illuminate everything. But it illuminated me. And that was enough. I stayed in the forest, where the fog hid the trees. But it didn't hide me. Because I was part of this silence. I wasn't looking for a way out. I was looking for meaning. I stayed in the words I didn't say. In the touches that didn't happen. In the looks that didn't meet. And all of this is also a part of me. I stayed because someone had to stay. Not to change the world. But to keep it from disappearing. I stayed because silence needs a witness. Because pain needs a presence. Because love isn't always an action. Sometimes it's just being. I stayed when it was dark. And in this darkness I learned to see. Not with my eyes. With my heart. I stayed when it was unclear. And in this incomprehensibility I learned to trust. Not with logic. With feeling. I stayed when it hurt. And in this pain I learned to live. Not to run away. By presence. Because staying is not about enduring. It's about being. Being where it's hard. Being where you need to be. Being where you are. And that's why I stayed. I didn't stay for anyone. This is important. Because for a long time I thought that I was staying for others. Not to disappoint. Not to disappear from someone's horizon. To be needed. But at some point I realized. I stayed for myself. Not to. I didn't stay for anyone. This is important. Because for a long time I thought that I was staying for others. Not to disappoint. Not to disappear from someone's horizon. To be needed. But at some point I realized. I stayed for myself. Not to be strong. But to be real. Not to endure. But to not betray myself. Because when everyone leaves, you can go with them. Or you can stay. And in this staying, to find yourself. I stayed because I didn't want to run away anymore. Because running away is also a form of silence. And I wanted to speak. Even if words were silence. I stayed because I was tired of being what people see me as. I wanted to be who I am. Without masks. Without roles. Without expectations. I stayed because I realized my silence is not emptiness. It is a space where I can breathe, where I can hear myself, where I can be. And it was in that silence that I felt myself for the first time. Not through noise, not through words, but through presence. The presence of myself within myself. The presence of myself in the moment. The presence of myself in the decision to stay. It wasn't easy. It wasn't obvious. But it was mine. And so I stayed. And now, when someone asks why I didn't leave, I don't explain. Because it's not about logic. It's about presence. I say, because I was. Sometimes being is all that is needed. Not acting. Not saving. Not changing. But just being. Being there when someone is silent. Being in a room where there is only light. Being in a forest where the fog hides the outlines, but not you. I stayed because I learned to listen to the silence. Because I learned to see in the dark. Because I learned to be without fear, even when fear was around. I stayed because it was my choice. Not the right one. Not convenient. But the real one. And now, when I look back, I don't regret it. Because it was in that moment when I stayed. I found myself. Now I know. Silence is not emptiness. It is space for truth. Space for healing. Space for being. And if you are now faced with a choice, to leave or to stay, don't look for the right answer. Just ask yourself, where are you? Because sometimes being is all that is needed.